Our next topic is returning stored procedure status. The stored procedures automatically return an integer status value. That value is 0 if the procedure does not have a separate value passed back to it, and if nothing untoward happened during the processing of the stored proc. -1 through -99 are returned for SQL errors detected by the DBMS. We'll talk about a few of those. It doesn't use them all, but it does return that many. Note that if you use a return which is greater than 0 or less than -99, that is something which you're going to have to deal with in trap. The server does not do anything with that subset of values. The calling program sets up a local variable to receive and check the return status, and that we will do in just a moment. Overall syntax looks like this. We create proc, name of the proc, and that, by the way, is the way almost every object is created in the SQL Server with very few exceptions. Create object type object name followed by object description. Note that within the scope of the create proc, I have as SQL statements and then return optional integer status value. The keyword return is not mandatory at the tail end of your stored procedures. However, it is a good practice. The reason it's a good practice is that in the past, a variety of front ends have behaved in a peculiar manner. You did not have an explicit return statement and just replied on an implicit return statement. As a result, I always put a return at the end of my procs. Note here that we can pass a status value. Let's talk about how to identify what that status is. When we call the proc, we execute a variable name to be the name of the proc. Now, this is kind of crazy looking syntax unless you're a C programmer, at which point this is a, oh, I bet they wrote this in C when it was originally written, and if that is your guess, you are correct. Rather than look at the syntax here, why don't we look at an example? Here we're creating a proc called titles for a pub, within which we're getting the list of titles for a particular publisher. This is out of the original pubs database that was shipped with the SQL Server back in the olden days being at least back as far as the 4.0 days when I got involved with SQL Server. You still can get this database up on the web if you search for pubs database. We're passing in a parameter here. The parameter is @pub_name. The type is varchar 40, and we are specifying a default, which is null. The first thing we're doing in this proc is checking to see if the pub was passed in. If it was not passed in, then it's going to be equal to the default, and we're going to return 15. Note that if we do not specify a default and we do not pass in the value, we'll get an error, and when we execute the stored procedure, it will not continue the stored procedure execution, and it will not do this particular check. The next thing we're doing within the scope of the proc is checking to see whether that publisher name actually exists. If the pub name does not exist, we're returning a different error code, which is -101. Finally, we're returning the list of all the titles which were published by that publisher. When that's done, we're returning a return code of 0. Now, how do we test this? We test this as follows. Within my batch, the first thing I do is declare a local variable, which I'm calling @status. Now I execute the stored procedure as follows. Execute my local variable @status equals name of the proc. Then I pass in the parameter. Again, this looks kludgy, but this syntax is correct and it works. Next thing I'm going to do is check the value of @status. Remember that local variables only exist for the duration of the batch in which you create them. So if you say declare @status go, execute @status equals, it's going to say, I don't know what this @status thing is. You haven't declared it, even though you just declared it. It needs to be part of that same batch. Likewise, if you declare @status and then execute @status as a batch and then subsequently try to check it, it's going to say, I don't have that variable. So make sure you do this all as part of the same batch or within a proc. If the status is 15, I print out a message saying invalid syntax. Note that I should probably put a more descriptive message in there. But this really is just a a hat rack for me to start talking about the fact that your error messages need to be really specific. A good practice is to put out a message saying this is how you use it. We'll be doing that in just a minute. Else, if at status equals -101, we print the message, we haven't got that publisher. So that message at least is a little more specific. So this is how we use it. This is what it looks like. The syntax is a little ugly and a little kludgy, but that's what we've got to work with. And this is the practice that we do want to follow. Here are the reserved keywords, the reserved status words. You will probably never see most of these. 0 you'll see frequently. That means nothing went wrong. But we also have codes that say things like, well, there was a table there and we were joining to it the last time we ran the proc, but this time we're running the proc, it disappeared. We have a variety of messages which are internal bugs. 8, 10, 11 are all SQL Server bugs. You don't see them very often. Resource issues you might see on occasion if, for example, an auto-expand failed to occur. So just be aware that these are reserved. These numbers are subject to change with each new release of the SQL Server. Now, stored procedure parameters can be assigned by default. If no value is supplied during the execution, we do recommend you supply default values for the stored procs and that you check them. Coming back to this proc, we've made it just a little bit smarter. The first thing we've done is check to see if the pub name is null. Now if the pub name is null, we're putting out a message which is a bit more descriptive. It says, pass in the publisher name as a parameter. Now if you hadn't guessed at the fact that we're doing titles for a publisher had gotten you that far, well, now you know it. Next, we're doing something which is a little bit creative. I am saying, bring back all the publishers where the pub name is like the variable passed in plus a %sign. Note, you may occasionally get bad optimization with this depending on the rest of the query and the rest of what you've got going on, and it may be smarter to append that %sign prior to calling the proc. However, this syntax, just the way it is valid, does work, and will get you the same results that you're looking for. And this lets you avoid typing in crazy long publisher names. Just get the first few characters in and bring back the titles. Note that if you're doing that, you might want to also bring back the publisher name on the off chance that two publishers have similar names. Now, at execution time, parameters can be specified positionally or by name. If they're passed by name, they can be passed in any order, and you can exclude some. If you're passing them positionally, you can't exclude any. They've all got to be there, and if any are missing at the tail end, they're going to be assumed to be null. Syntax looks like this. Exec or execute, name of the procedure. Now we start passing in the parameter names. At parm name equals, specify the expression. In this example, I have a proc called myProc. There are 3 parameters, at val1, at val2, and at val3. In the first example, we're saying execute myProc 10, 20, 15. Because these are passed in sequence and positionally, the 10 goes to val1, the 20 goes to val2, and the 15 goes to val3. In the second example, we're passing them by name. We're specifying at val2 equals 20, at val1 equals 10, and at val3 equals 15. Note that these give us equivalent result sets, equivalent types of performance. We're just passing it a little bit differently. Now, the question here, though, does become what's more efficient, passing it by name or passing it positionally? And I'm going to give you an answer. Passing the parameters positionally makes the parser work a little bit less hard. As a result, if you were to run this a couple 100,000 times, all back to back, you'd be able to measure a little bit of difference in the performance simply because the parser's got to do a little bit more work if you're passing these things by name. You're not going to measure a lot of difference. You're going to measure a little bit of difference. As a result, my recommendation is that you pass the parameters by name. Why do we want to pass them by name? Two reasons. First, it's really good documentation. Going back to an experience I had a decade and a half ago, is it more interesting to look at somebody else's stored procedure call and say, execute stored procedure 122, 1, 3, 1, 4, Fred, 2, 0, 3678, and then pass all the parameters in? Or is it more useful to look at somebody else's code and read, execute stored procedure 121, at use flag equals 1, at edit flag equals 2, at in country flag equals 3, etc. The second one allows you to have a much better handle on what the stored procedure is getting passed, and if you need to change some values, it makes it much easier to change those things. So marginally faster to pass it positionally, much better documentation to pass it by name. The other benefit is that if the stored procedure changes and somebody adds additional parameters, if they're adding the parameters to the end, which they should, then passing them positionally shouldn't be a problem. But if somebody makes a modification and gets the clever idea to, for example, alphabetize all the parameters, and I have seen something like that happen. If you're passing the parameters by name, that change to the stored procedure is not going to affect you. So, pass by name or by position. You can actually mix that up and pass some by name and some by position, but if you start passing by name, you have to finish passing by name. Ignore the rule, just don't do it that way. Pass by name or by position.